All right, now today we're going to talk about the Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent is one of the earliest river valley civilizations that exists. Now, the Fertile Crescent is here, sort of in the Middle East, between Africa and Europe and the larger part of Asia. Now, the Fertile Crescent refers to two different places. It refers to Mesopotamia, which is the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia is literally translated the land between two rivers. And the east coast of the Mediterranean. And together, these two regions, which were sort of very fertile ground, make it kind of a crescent shape. So the Fertile Crescent, it includes Mesopotamia and the east coast of the Mediterranean. Now, the Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates River, which provided plentiful water, but it took a lot of labor to create irrigation systems. They didn't flood regularly, so they had to dig these canals long distances to bring water from the rivers to the crops. This took a lot of labor. They also didn't have many resources, sort of natural resources like metals or lumber or anything like that they could build stuff out of. So they needed to trade with its neighbors to get things that they needed. They also were really organized into city-states at first. A city-state is a city that governs itself, which in all these city-states generally compete for control over the resources because there's not very many resources. So there's going to be a lot of violence in Mesopotamia. And because of this competition over resources, they're going to develop empires. And this is where one civilization expands by conquering another. And normally it would be they would start out as a city-state and they would slowly grow and grow, taking over more people, which makes them an empire. Now, the first city-state is Sumer. This is the first civilization to ever develop around 3,500 to 2,300 BCE. Now, they created also a lot of firsts here. The first writing system called cuneiform, which was a pictograph writing system. They also had a religion called a polytheistic religion where they believed in many gods, and they thought generally that these gods were mean, that they were irritable and harsh, and that if you weren't obedient, the gods would kind of come down and basically destroy you. And a lot of this belief comes from the environment in which they lived in. Mesopotamia the environment wasn't very kind to people. It was kind of a harsh environment. And so they sort of attributed these descriptions to their gods as well. Now, with these gods, they built things called ziggurats, you see up here, which were large pyramid-like temples to worship all the gods. And there was one famous ruler named Gilgamesh. He was a king of the city of Urk, which was in Sumer. And he was believed to have fought and defeated a lot of the gods. And there's this famous story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that tells about him. But a lot of what we know about Sumerian society comes from the stories about Gilgamesh. The next two civilizations were the Babylonians and the Hittites. The Babylonians were from 1900 to 1600 BCE, and they gained control over most of Mesopotamia, including Sumer. And they had one famous king named Hammurabi, and he wrote the first set of laws, the Code of Hammurabi. Now, these laws promoted social hierarchy, but they still provided protection for everyone, even the slaves. It is also said to be given by Hammurabi by the gods. Now, Babylon was conquered by the Hittites. The Hittites ruled from 1700 to 1200 BCE. And they started out as nomadic pastoralists. But when they conquered Babylon mostly because of their use of iron and because of horse-drawn chariots, which they were able to use in battle. The Hittites were conquered by the Assyrians from 911 to 612 BCE. And they created really the first large-scale empire. Now, the other ones had empires, but they were smaller. Assyria was large. And they had a superior military. They had cavalry, which means the warriors were riding on horseback, which gave them an advantage on battle. But they also created the first body armor and continued the use of iron weapons, which the Hittites had done first. Now, the Assyrians had a government called a meritocracy, and this is where they chose the military leaders based on skill rather than birth. Most people at the time, you were born into your position, but this one was based off of how much skills you had. Now, the Assyrians were known to be extremely cruel to conquered people. They would do really bad things like peeling off your skin and letting birds eat you alive if you went against their laws. They also created the first large-scale library that was located in their capital, Nineveh. The Assyrians were taken over by some people called the Chaldeans, which called themselves the Neo-Babylonians, and then they were conquered by the Persians. Now, Persia was the largest empire of its time, existing from 550 BCE to 331 BC. And they conquered Mesopotamia, almost to Greece. They conquered Egypt, and then all the way to the Indus River Valley. Now, when they did this, when they conquered people, they made these people pay tribute, which is basically a tax to Persia. But they were also very tolerant of local customs. As long as people were paying the tribute, they were very tolerant. They let the rulers that were in power stay in power as long as they didn't fight against Persia, as long as they submitted to them and paid tribute. They also unified this very large region by creating the Great Royal Road. It ran almost from Greece down through Mesopotamia and then over to South Asia as well. They created a postal service which would deliver mail extremely quickly, a single currency, and because of all this, it increased trade, connecting these several early civilizations. They also believed in a religion called Zoroastrianism, which was monotheistic, that worshipped Ahura Mazda, and they sort of started the idea of this conflict between good and evil within kind of Western society, that there's a good God and a bad God that are constantly fighting each other. They also believed in an afterlife and believed that you could achieve it by pleasing the gods, or by pleasing God. Now, the Hebrews were another group of people. They never really were very powerful in Fertile Crescent, but they're very important to history because of the influences they have later on. Now, they exist through all of these civilizations, starting with Sumer. Now, Hebrews are descendants of Abraham, which lived in Sumer, but generally speaking, they are nomadic pastoral people. They kind of moved around with herds of animals. They did create a small, short-lived empire on the east coast of the Mediterranean, but it really didn't last for very long. Most of their history is actually spent enslaved, either by Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, or Persia. That's a lot of their history. Now, they believed in one God, Yahweh, so they weren't monotheistic. They held that God as a loving and caring and forgiving God, that you could have a personal relationship, much different than the ideas of the Babylonian polytheism. And a lot of the Hebrew or Judaic ideas were formed in the Torah, which is basically the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible. And they believed that the Jews were God's chosen people, and that they were there to represent Him on earth. Now, the last civilization we're going to talk about is the Phoenicians, and they also lived on the east coast of the Mediterranean, but they were also really great sailors. So they sailed throughout the Mediterranean at this time, and they increased trade between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. Now, they create the first alphabet, which is where you use letters to represent words, which you can kind of create meaning from. Much different than using a picture to represent words. This is a much more efficient way of writing, easier to learn, and this alphabet is going to spread to other places and help them communicate better. So that is the Fertile Crescent. If you will be continuing other civilizations in other videos.